As you got me now, a deep dive into RxJS subjects, and as you can already see, in this slide, I have a lot of diagrams because I strongly believe that visualizing all those processes over time is one of the best learning benefits and learning tools we could get out there. Because of this very reason, you will see a lot of those diagrams in the following slides. So, if you Google for what a subject is, you most of the time find something like that. A subject is a special type of observable with the observer exposed. And at least I was a little bit buzzed. I had no clue what I should do with that sentence and started to research and try to understand on my own how we could look at a subject. And to understand a subject, I will start with an observable. My name is Hladky. I'm a software consultant trainer, run several workshops and events a year, and I'm super happy if you book my trainings and workshops, so feel free to contact me. But now let's get back to observables, and I will do something here in this slide. On the left side, I will always present a diagram, and on the right side, I will present snippets of code, and I will highlight the line that is active at the very moment. So if we look at the right side, we see that we create a new observable here, and this is it. Not a lot of stuff is happening, and I can zoom in a little bit, and we see that observables are pretty lazy. And what can we do with observables to somehow kick them, to start them, let them like initialize and observe something? We could call subscribe. Subscribe is a public method on the observable. As we can see in the diagram, this small circle is reaching out of the box, and the box is my observable scope, my class. The subscription is somehow the glue between the producer and the consumer side. So let's take a little bit more look and information into subscriptions. So if you call subscribe, you will initialize this observable, and you will get something returned. You will get a subscription returned. A subscription, another object that you have now in your hands. And what you can do with that subscription is you could also unsubscribe from it. As we can see, the unsubscribe, the small U circle here, is belonging to the subscription object and not to the observable. As this is quite an interesting part, subscriptions, let me add a little bit more detailed information. So subscriptions do have different methods that we barely use. They don't only have subscribe, observable subscribe. A subscription could also add another subscription to itself or remove one, and we could also nest them in that way. So why is that so important? Why do I mention that? If we take a look at a very, very simple snippet of RxJS, where we have an auth observable and then a pipe with two operators, subscribe and unsubscribe, we see that all those functions are nested, are wrapped into each other, and they subscribe and unsubscribe always to their parent. So this is what's happening under the hood, and I guess pretty useful information to get the bigger picture of how RxJS is working internally. Let's go on and let's take a closer look inside of this subscribe function. And here I marked a spot where I can place code that helps me to observe emissions. So at this very place here in my subscribe function, I will place the observer. What is the observer? Well, an observer is just a set of callbacks, I would say, and those callbacks fire on the different reactive lifecycles hooks like the next, error, and the complete event or notification. Every notification has a symbol, circle is a value, X is an error, and the pipe here is the complete. And if we take a look in the code, it would look like that. I have an object with a key value pair. One key value pair is next with a next callback that takes a property, the next value. Error is the same style of functions. I also take an error as the property, as the function parameter. And then complete is a little bit different. This callback is not taking any parameters. It just fires on the specific hook, on the specific moment in time when our observable completes. So this object is forwarded to my observable, and this object will show up in a very small code snippet up there, and you can see that we receive the observer inside inside the subscriber function, the little snippet that you see there, and we call observer.next. And this will emit or forward the value to our callback function, and we can log it. Then we have error, which works pretty much the same, and then complete. But what would happen? What would happen if I call next after complete? That wouldn't make sense at all. We also would run into an error, and we would have to make sure, we would have to wrap repetitive logic in all our observers to ensure these standard situations, next after complete is not possible, error after complete is not possible, and so on. So we need a way to protect our observer and to also get away some of the coding overload to our users. So what we can do is we can take another closer look, even closer to the subscribe function of our observable. And if we take a closer look, we see that when we pass the observer into our subscribe function, inside of the observable, we wrap our observer with a subscriber. We create a new subscriber and pass the observer to it. And the subscriber wraps the observer, and this very tiny thing, the subscriber takes care about all the different situations that I would have to handle on my own. So this is a really cool snippet that helps us to secure the observer, to make sure that the observer will not ran into these error situations, and that the user don't have to implement all those edge case protections on their own. So this is pretty cool. And when the new subscriber is created, this new subscriber is then forwarded to our subscriber function. And this function is then called, and the subscriber function is the very function you put in when you create a new observable. And this function will, as you now know, get called when you call subscribe. Pretty cool. And then I can call next, error, and complete on my subscriber function. And my subscriber function makes sure that everything follows the rule, that every call is the right one. And if I have odd calls, as we can see here in gray, that they will just not run into an order. So they ensure the right order in time, I could say. And this is pretty cool, and they help us to receive all those values. But yeah, and they forward, of course, the values to the observer. But the problem here is I always speak about values, and I always speak about that the values are produced and observed and this and that. I never spoke about the producer part. So where are all those values produced that I observe? Let's take a closer look in that and talk about the producer. So this is a very small snippet of code. We have a variable I that is 0, and then I create an interval with setInterval, and I will call the callback function of this interval every 1000 milliseconds. So every second. And every second I call a random function and increment a number. If we take this snippet of code from the producer and we would move it into our observable diagram, it would show up in our subscriber function. Now let's have a look how it looks. This is our producer snippet. The only difference here compared to the previous code snippet is instead of calling a random function and increment the value, I call the subscriber.next function to increment the value. So now I have those values that are incremented observed through the subscriber. Pretty cool, huh? And the subscriber calls next and forwards the values to my observer, and the observer holds all my callbacks, and in those callbacks I can run my custom logic. There is something else that we forgot. So if I start something, I obviously have to stop it somehow. And I do that by the unsubscribe function. So here I call unsubscribe, and now I want to show what happens inside of the observable if I call unsubscribe. So every subscriber function has a return value. Every subscriber function returns the tear down function. A function that is here to be responsible for tearing down all the stuff, all the asynchronous processes that I started inside. And in our case, I started the setInterval, and maybe you know it, setInterval always returns the async ID, an ID referring to that very initialization of this interval here. I stored this ID, I called it IID, interval ID, and I call clear interval on this specific ID in my teardown function. And this teardown function is returned. And when I call unsubscribe internally, this returned teardown function will also get called and tears down my internal producer logic. So it tears down the producer. So what we learned now about the subscriber function and the producer is I initialize the producer over subscribe, and I tear down the producer over unsubscribe, and this is done over the tear down function. Amazing, and also our diagram as well as the code looks pretty complete. Let's have a quick recap and then finish up with observables, because the original topic was a subject, right? And now we talked about observables all day long. So let's recap. The blue box here is my observable scope, is the scope of my class. And I can call a public method that is called subscribe. When I do that, I will get a subscription returned. This subscription takes an observer snippet, like a next error and complete callback, and then is wrapped into a subscriber. And this subscriber is then forwarded to the subscriber function that I placed in my new observable. Inside of this function, I will initialize my producer. And then I also create the snippet that can tear down the producer and return it. If my producer does something, it produces values, it nexts values to the subscriber forwards those values to the next of the observer, and in that way, these values end up in my next callback of the observer. Pretty cool. At the end, I can unsubscribe, and this is the whole life cycle of an observable. Here, I did again another graphic, but just static one without animations, and I colored it a little bit so that we can distinguish the different building blocks in an observable and can relate those colors to the different colors in my slide deck. Enough about subjects. Let's talk enough about observables. Let's talk about subjects. And before I dive deep into subjects, I want to state a little problem with observables. So as the producer is unique for every observable, it always lives and is created inside of my observable. So what would happen if it is for some reason not possible to create the producer inside of my observable? So the producer sits outside of the observable. Well, I would end up in a pretty ugly contract. I would have my subscriber function somehow exposed and my teardown, and really bad. So for this problem, RxJS came up, or Rx in general, the pattern, it's not a library, right? Came up with something that is called a subject. So what is a subject? A subject nicely separates the logic that is responsible for observing and the logic that is responsible for producing. And what we can see here is that my subject holds an observer and exposes the observer's methods, next, error, and complete, to the outside, to the public world. And then my producer living in the outside world can call subject next, the public method subject next, on this very class. And in that way, they have a nicely separated contract. Inside of my subject, how does it work? Well, whenever I subscribe to my subject, I forward the observer, and the observer is stored in an array. And this array is then cached. And when my next value arrives, I don't next a value on my subscriber as I did with the observable. I go through the array and iterate over it and next on all the registered observers. And in that way, I can forward one incoming next value to multiple subscribers from one single producer. And this is pretty cool. And here I have another graphic that demonstrates, that displays that I can have multiple subscribers, multiple observers, and their observer next function in this case is called multiple, or to be more specific, 2 times here in this diagram. So this is like the big picture of a subject that helps you with that. A subject has one downside, as a subject is not relying on the subscriber, it is hot all the time. So I could next values into my subject and there is not yet a subscriber. In this case, I could miss values. In this diagram, I miss the first value, -1, and I only receive all the values after that subscription. So this is something that we should keep in mind. Let's compare them again. We have the producer part in the observable, it's inside, on the subject it's outside. In the observable, I have the subscriber function and the teardown function that is connected and tied to my producer. On the other side, on the subject, the producer is responsible on its own for its starting and stopping and just calls the next, error, and complete functions on the subject. The rest is pretty much the same if you look on the subscription part. So a subject is multicasting values, has one subscriber multicasted to multiple subscribers, and an observable has a producer for one subscriber. So one producer for one subscriber, one producer for multiple subscribers. Okay. Now, as we understand all the different internals of observables and subjects, let me dive into subjects a little bit more detailed. There are 5 different public subjects. I will only talk about 4 of them: the subject, the behavior subject, the replay subject, and the async subject. And if you want to know about the last subject, the WebSocket subject, you can check out Lami's talks online. She has pretty cool content on that one. But let's start with the subject. And a subject is basically here to forward multiple values to one value to multiple observers at the same time. So if I subscribe to a subject, the box here is a subject, and I subscribe to it, I'm able to receive these nexted values. And if I subscribe a second time, not only the first subscriber, but also the second one will receive those values. And this is valid for all the other values in the future. When a subject completes, of course, it also forwards the completion event to one or multiple subscribers. But what happens if you subscribe to an already completed subject? What do you think? Well, it forwards the complete again and again and again every time when you subscribe to it. And in this case, you can somehow get an answer on what is the state of this subject. with the error is the same, and if you resubscribe to an already errored subject, you will again get re-emitted the error. So a subject is here to solve this multicasting problem, to separate those contracts, and you can do already pretty cool stuff with it. You can create message buses, notification systems, and so on and so forth. It could be driven by pretty much any code, any producer you like. There's another really cool subject, and this is called the behavior subject. A behavior subject not only forwards a value from a producer to multiple subscribers, it also replays the last one, and it has also one more specifica. It has an initial value. So a behavior subject is here to observe the behavior of a value. And here is my initial value, 0. So nothing happens, no subscriber, and it is already initialized with 0. And when I subscribe the first time to it, then from this very cache that is like placed on the bottom edge of this box, I can retrieve the last cached value. Newer values are cached again and forwarded after another. If I have a new subscriber, I will get re-emitted the last cached value. In this case, it is 1, and then again, I will cache and forward the values for all the other subscribers. So if a behavior subject completes, same with the subject, it forwards the completion event. But what about resubscribing to a behavior subject that is already completed? Same as with the subject, I just get the completion event back and know the state that it is already completed. And this goes in the same way for the error event. So a subject could be used for building a lightweight state management system. I use it a lot in libraries like Rx, Angular State, and other state management libraries. One of the last subjects and one of the mightiest but also biggest subjects in terms of bundle size is the replay subject. But I really like it because it has some such cool implementation details that I want to share with you. So every subject forwards from a producer to multiple observers, but the replay subject could also inform us about the whole history of a producer. And this could be done in a variety of ways. So let's start with the very basic case. I subscribe to a replay subject. And nothing happens. And then my subject emits a value, I cache this value, and this time I don't have a single value cache, I have a cache that can cache multiple values. And I forward it. Another value and it gets cached, another value, and now I have 3 values in my cache and it gets forwarded. And then I have a new subscriber, and this new subscriber will get re-emitted all the cached values in order. 1, 2, 3. And after the re-emission is done, a next value can occur, and I will receive this next value, and the next value is again cached. Of course, a replay subject can also complete. So what do you think? What happens if a replay subject completes and I resubscribe to it? Because the case of completion is pretty clear for the first subscription when you subscribe to it and then completes. But what if it is completed and you subscribe to it? You will receive the full history of the replay subject and then the complete. So it is really replaying its whole life. Of course, maybe there is also an error, but an error is also part of the life of the replay subject. So you will also re-emit the 2 values and the error. But sometimes you want to restrict it a little bit and you don't want to cache every single value, but just a slice of the history of this subject. In this case, you can add a parameter that is called buffer size. And here I set the buffer size to 2. And with the first in, first out principles, I will maintain a buffer that holds two values at max, and then I will re-emit those two values. And then I kick out the last one and I add the new one to this cache. The rest is pretty much the same. There's another parameter that is called window time. And window time is really cool because window time let you assign a lifetime to every single value. And if you can look at that diagram here, the lifetime is 7 milliseconds. And if we have a duration of 5 milliseconds for the first emission, I will cache the first and the second value. Then I have another emission after 8 milliseconds, another emission after 3 milliseconds. And at the end, the values 1, 2, and 3 are outdated. And I will only receive the number 4 because this lives 5 milliseconds. Everything else is older than 5 milliseconds and therefore will not get shared. I can use them also together and mix the buffer size and the window time. This would also work. So this is pretty cool. And I can do a lot of stuff, store, replay, historical data, and can also replay like the full history of some processes. The last and most important subject is the async subject. The async subject is used everywhere in the web, and it forwards the last value after its completion. So pretty weird, it emits values, and nothing happens, not to the first, not to the second subscriber. Only if the subject completes, it will forward the last emitted value and then the completion event. So this is the specifica of the async subject. It will also replay the last value and complete if you resubscribe to it. For the error, it is same with all the other but the replay subject. So the async subject, as I told you, is used everywhere in the web. Let me show you the list that I came up with on where you can use it. I have no clue. I have really no clue. I believe it's some internal thing. You can observe a process and only do something if the process is done. But I would also know other things to do that. So I'm not really sure. But these are my 2 cents on the async subject. And I want to sum up. We had the observable, all the building blocks, the observable versus the subject, all the different types, all the use cases, and all the very cool use cases for the async subject. As the time is out now, I have to say thanks a lot. A quick shout out on my design system. I worked on it 2 years or something. And now it is able to visualize pretty much anything you have in RxJS present. So feel free to check it out on this link here. And that's pretty much it from my side. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your time and goodbye.